June 1991. Sony had just announced the biggest partnership in gaming. 24 hours later, Nintendo betrayed them in front of the entire world. What nobody in that room knew was that Nintendo had just created its biggest rival.
It started with sound. The NES had weak audio. For its next console, the Super Famicom, Nintendo needed better. A young Sony engineer named Ken Kutaragi saw that gap and built the solution on his own, without his own management even signing off on it. Most of Sony didn't take games seriously. They were toys. But Kutaragi's chip worked, and it gave him something he didn't have before: a foothold inside Nintendo's hardware. That's where the bigger idea was born. CD-ROM was coming. Cheaper than cartridges, bigger capacity, more power. Why not go further? In 1988, Sony president Norio Oga signed off on it. Build a CD-ROM add-on for the SNES, together with Nintendo. The project's name? PlayStation. Buried in that contract was a clause neither side was thinking about yet. It would blow up everything. The deal gave Sony full licensing rights over every CD format game released on the system. Not Nintendo, Sony. That single line struck the foundation of Nintendo's entire business. Nintendo's real power was never the console, it was control. Who gets to publish, what gets approved, what cut they take. This contract handed that leverage to a company already bigger than they were. By early 1991, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi understood exactly what he'd built. Not a partner, but a future rival. Sony already made the SNES sound chip, and developers increasingly relied on Sony's own development tools just to use it. Yamauchi's next move would define everything that followed. Get out. Quietly. Chicago, CES, June 1991. Day 1. Sony walks on stage and unveils the PlayStation, a hybrid console that plays both SNES cartridges and CDs. Games are already in development. This is Sony's first real step into the games industry, and they're taking it as Nintendo's partner. The room applauded. Nintendo's name was right there on the announcement. Day 2. Same building. Nintendo steps up to its own press conference. Howard Lincoln tells the assembled press that their engineers concluded, from a technical standpoint, it made more sense to partner with Philips instead. That was the official line. The real reason had nothing to do with engineering. It was about taking back control. The next morning's business pages called it a slap in Sony's face. For decades afterward, industry writers would call it one of the ugliest betrayals in tech history. Think about what actually happened on that floor. The partner you shook hands with on stage yesterday was shaking hands with your rival today, in the same room, in front of the same press, 24 hours later. None of this happened overnight. It had been decided a month earlier, in secret. May 1991. Two Nintendo of America executives, Howard Lincoln and Minoru Arakawa, fly to the Netherlands, to Philips' headquarters in Eindhoven. There, they sign a different deal entirely. Philips builds its own CD add-on for the SNES, and in return, Nintendo gets full licensing control back. As part of the arrangement, Philips is even granted rights to use Mario and Zelda, characters that would go on to appear in a handful of CDI games, now remembered as some of gaming's strangest. The whole thing was negotiated with Sony completely in the dark. Secrets have a way of leaking anyway.
On May 31st, just 2 days before CES, the Seattle Times ran a story on the Nintendo Philips talks. It was already public. Sony simply hadn't read it, or hadn't wanted to believe it. Inside Sony, the fallout was brutal. Part of the board wanted the whole project killed on the spot. A clear sign, they argued, that gaming wasn't Sony's business. For a moment, Kutaragi looked like the engineer who'd burned company resources on a dead end. One man decided otherwise: Norio Oga. Oga was classically trained in music, and he could see the potential in Kutaragi's work more clearly than most of the board. Against internal objections, he made the call: keep the team. Strangely, talks between the two companies didn't fully collapse either. In early 1992, they reached a patched-up arrangement. Sony could still manufacture SNES-compatible hardware, while Nintendo kept licensing and revenue. 200 to 300 PlayStation prototypes were even built. But the trust was gone. The contract survived. The partnership didn't. Kutaragi saw the opening and pushed for something bigger. Forget the add-on. Build a standalone console. He convinced Oga. In November 1993, Sony Computer Entertainment was formed, with Kutaragi at the head of it. A year later, PlayStation launched in Japan. CDs instead of cartridges. A simpler and more affordable development process instead of expensive dev kits. Instead of the tightly controlled model Nintendo had spent years protecting, Sony built something closer to a computing platform. Cheap media, wide third-party support, a much broader audience. The result? PlayStation went on to sell over 100 million units, far outselling the Nintendo 64 in the same generation. And it set the template for a platform model that still defines the industry today. PlayStation, Xbox, even Steam. Nintendo spent years trying to keep Sony out of gaming. Ironically, Nintendo was the one who opened the door. And once Sony walked through it, the industry never looked the same again.
Thinking about this. It may look like a harmless bagel toaster, but inside is a deadly donut.
Nintendo didn't create PlayStation on purpose, but its decision gave Sony every reason to build one.